Welcome to Anther Dish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. In the Western world, we rely on our fridges and freezers on a daily basis, to the point where it's rarely a consideration that we once lived without refrigeration and had to store our foods in other ways. How has the invention of fridges shifted our relationships with food? How has it changed our cooking, eating, and preservation practices? These are all fascinating points of consideration that are often overlooked, but perhaps the most interesting element of refrigeration is the design of fridges itself, and how that's informed our collective food waste behavior. My guest this week, Emma Atkins, is here to explore the role that refrigeration has played in our food waste. Emma is a PhD researcher at the University of Bristol in the UK. Her research looks at how fridges influence food waste, whether it's through design or its place in the food system that's geared towards overconsumption. She has a background in policy and advocacy and recently wrote 2 reports tackling policy solutions for food waste as well as quality of food donations through FoodRise, which is a UK and EU-based NGO. Her website, Food Waste Stories, features articles about food waste in art, culture, policy, and academia, and advocates for a sustainable food system. In today's conversation, I speak with Emma about how fridges have evolved from the earliest 1920s designs to become embedded in our modern food culture, the relationship between fridges and Costco hauls, the extreme fridge organization trends on TikTok, and the possibilities of more sustainably minded fridge designs to reduce food waste in the future. Here's my conversation with Emma. All right, welcome to the show, Emma. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm so excited to chat with you. I know we've connected online over the years, and I'm a huge fan of your work. So before we jump into it, do you mind giving a bit of a snapshot of who you are, where you're coming in from, and the type of work that you do?
Sure. I'm Emma Atkins. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Bristol in the UK. My PhD is looking at food waste in households, and specifically how the design of the domestic refrigerator can influence food waste. So either through its design, by having sort of deep shelves and drawers where food can get lost and we forget about it and it goes to waste, but also its sort of place in the food system.
Oh, I'm so excited to dig into this today. It's such a cool topic. I think it's one of those pieces where, especially in day-to-day life, people take it for granted that there's this really rich history of refrigeration. So do you mind taking us back to kind of where refrigeration starts? From the little that I know, there's, ice boxes in the 1800s, and then we move into refrigeration. But what are some of the ways that ice boxes then informed how we think about modern refrigeration?
Sure, yeah. I mean, people have been cooling food for centuries and thousands of years. But the fridge as we know it today, as you said, first came in the form of an ice box. And it was patented in the USA in 1838, if I remember correctly. I actually have a picture of it. I know you've got a YouTube channel. If anyone on audio wants to pause or quickly go to your YouTube channel, see a picture of an icebox. This is what it is. So it's literally a wooden cupboard with this enormous sort of shelf in it for literally a piece of ice. And then as the ice melted, the cold air would circulate and cool the other food inside, which were on other shelves. So that was sort of the first iteration of the fridge as we know it. And that sort of existed for quite a long time. And then electric refrigeration and gas absorption refrigeration came in sort of towards the late 1800s. But interestingly, when the first fridge as we know it appeared, the design didn't differ that much from the icebox because the fridge manufacturers didn't want consumers not to know what it was because they were already having to introduce this new technology to them and they didn't want to scare them off too much. So it's interesting to me because the fridge has always been a box, and it's because of the icebox and because the fridge manufacturers didn't want to sort of drift too far away from what people were used to. And before the first sort of hermetically sealed fridge appeared, people would retrofit their iceboxes with the mechanical compressor, which sometimes was so big, it was quite big. It was like maybe as big as a dog.
Wow.
And sometimes they had to be put in the basement, and then the wires would come up into the kitchen, into the floor. But I have a picture of the first hermetically sealed fridge.
Cool.
It's the front cover of this book here.
Oh, wow.
And it's got the compressor on the top. But it's all one system.
Wow.
It looks like it's got a little hat. So that's what it looked like. So it went from that to that.
Oh, I see the similarities. That's so interesting.
But yeah, it's never not been a box. And actually my research is finding that the box shape is actually kind of one of the problems. And I find that nobody's really questioned the shape of it yet.
Whoa, okay. That's one of those things where I can imagine for those that are exposed to that technology in the 1800s for the first time, that's a pretty radical shift from, food storage and preservation systems that were being practiced prior to that too. So I think you'd written something really recently where you're talking about how like President Roosevelt had some impact on like which fridge designs ended up becoming more popular. Do you mind sharing a little bit about how that came to be and why we still have that sort of box design flaws and all with it?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. So the theoretical framework that I'm using for my PhD is called Science and Technology Studies, and it's part of sociology or human geography. And the argument essentially is that we have technology now, not necessarily because it's the best version of what could have happened, but because of other compounding factors that sort of led to the stabilization of whatever we have. And one of the reasons we have electric fridges, as you were alluding to, is because I think in the early 40s or maybe early 30s, I can't remember, President Roosevelt decided to sort of initiate this program of electrification in the USA to enable households to have electricity. And this is one of the reasons why electric fridges sort of succeeded, because at the same time as they were coming to be, there was also gas fridges, and they were using similar physics for cooling, but they were using different technology and different matter, I guess, to make things cold. And so it was because of the electrification of households, and also the fridge companies that were using electricity, like General Electric, were a lot more powerful than the gas fridges companies. So those are sort of the reasons why we have electric fridges. And yeah, and as I sort of said, we have the box because of the icebox. So all of these things sort of converge to make the fridge as we know it today. And it's not necessarily the best version, but that's why we have it. And my PhD sort of looks at why it came to be, but also what the problems are with it now in terms of food waste.
Yeah, because that's such a big thing, right? Where we're not necessarily thinking about the impact that like government initiatives, funding, policies are informing how the designs of like our day-to-day technologies are used. Particularly now, I find it's interesting if you're looking at like the impact between technology and government, especially in certain, like in the States. I think there's some interesting like technocrat issues with that too. But I'm curious, like from a design perspective, what are some of those flaws of the modern fridge designs, and, how do they affect food preservation or food waste?
Yeah, so I can tell you a bit about my studies. I essentially went into the homes of 19 people in Bristol, here in the UK. Went in and we talked about their fridge, and we had the fridge there. And they gave me like a tour around the fridge, and we discussed how they used it. And then I took a photo of it. And then I came back a week later and sort of compared what was going on in their fridge now compared to last week and what happened to the food. And that was really interesting. We had another discussion. And then I came back a final time, either 2 or 3 weeks after that. And in the meantime, I asked them to put a Post-it note inside their fridge where food went off in the fridge. So if something went off in the back, one of the shelves, they'd put a Post-it note there. So the final interview was talking about the arrangement of Post-its in the fridge and why they think it was in those areas. And then I sort of sketched out where all the Post-its were in the fridges to see if there were some areas that were more prone to waste than others. And one of my participants categorized the backs of fridges as the danger zone.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of waste happened in the back because people just couldn't see it, or they forgot about it, or it was hidden behind other things. And also the vegetable drawer was a really big space for where food went to waste the most. Again, because people just couldn't see what was happening in there. So yeah, I'm sort of finding that this box shape isn't the best design for food waste because things just get lost in the back. And if fridges, for example, were slightly shallower, so you could only store things like 1 or 2 items deep, that might be sort of a design solution. But yeah, that's sort of the conclusions I sort of came to. But as you're sort of alluding to as well, the design of the fridge also sort of encourages different food cultures. So particularly like a filling up impulse.
Yeah.
That I've seen, and that sort of some of my participants alluded to. And that sort of, I guess, influenced the food system to an extent as well.
It's so interesting. I was thinking about you because I have this funny part of my fridge where things magically go disappearing, and it's not even that we can't see it. It's, if I have like a box of herbs, somehow it falls between the like a couple of the shelves, and then you actually can't see it, so you'll smell it before you. But it'll take months before I find, the green onions that we have there. But it's such a fascinating thing because I think too about, particularly with the rise of supermarkets, that's been something I've been really going in a rabbit hole of research myself recently. So do you mind speaking a little bit to those sorts of relationships that you're seeing through your research and through the historical documents? How much are fridges tied to this, rise of supermarkets, this abundance of food accessibility, so-called, right? Is there a relationship there?
Yeah, definitely. Some studies have explicitly made the connection between the rise of supermarkets and the rise of fridges, because essentially when people were using home preservation methods, they were tended to go to the sort of local market every day. And because sort of storage at home wasn't available, they'd buy every day to make a meal on that day, and then the next day do the same thing, or maybe keep things for 1 or 2 days. And the fridge allows you to store things for a much longer time, and therefore people didn't have to go to the shop so often, and they were also able to sort of stock up and when they did go to the shop, which led to sort of this evolution of supermarkets and also the increased size of fridges. So you see fridges, I've got like a graph that basically shows how much they increased in size in the mid 20th century, and supermarkets appeared in the 50s, I think, in the USA. And so you have this symbiotic relationship between them in that supermarkets allow you to buy a lot at once and fridges allow you to store a lot at once. And it's that relationship that really allowed both of these sort of food phenomena to exist, and also cars. And so to be able to transport it to your home. And yeah, the suburbanization of America sort of was a catalyst for that as well.
Wow. Yeah, it's really cool to put all those pieces together, especially if you think about, where we are now with refrigeration. And I think back, I speak a lot with my grandma because she grew up on a farm like right before electricity hit rural Ontario. And so she has a lot of memories of different food preservation systems. But her freezer is just stocked full of things that she'll never get to. So that really makes me think about like how much our mindset has shifted around. I think you had mentioned it before, like the scarcity mindset of needing to like collect food. And I'd imagine the impact that that's had on food waste. Like, are we able to actually eat everything that we're putting in these gigantic box fridges that we have?
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. You should get your grandma to be on this podcast.
Yeah.
I'm sure she'd have
She
so
would
many
hate it.
amazing insights how food culture has changed. Yeah. So I think because fridges allow for a lot of storage, we probably tend to overbuy. And actually, it's in the supermarket's interest for us to overbuy. And there was a study done by a UK food NGO that showed that the biggest retailer in the UK profits about £4 billion a year of food waste in our homes because we're buying stuff we never get to and therefore have to buy more because we've wasted it. So it's sort of in their interest to sort of push as much food on us as possible, and fridges make that possible. And I was actually speaking to a Canadian colleague of mine at the university, and he was like, it's so funny because we have, like in Canada, I don't know if you do, but he was saying, I have a much bigger fridge in Canada than I do in the UK. And he was saying, but the packaging sizes are also bigger in the US. So he was talking about how he went to the UK and went to buy some yogurt, and it was in a much smaller pot than he's used to. In Canada, he'd get like a 3-litre pot of yogurt with space in his fridge to store it.
Totally.
So I also wonder if there's something about that as well, and that fridges not only allow us to store more at once, but also allow for bigger portion sizes of things. And a lot of my participants, as well as saying that, oh yeah, things get lost in the back and in drawers, they're also saying that one of the problems with food waste is that supermarkets sometimes don't allow you to buy loose vegetables, things like that. So you're forced to buy like enormous bags of carrots or potatoes. And potatoes are like the number one thing that is wasted in the UK. And it's often because we can't buy them loose. You have to buy big bags of them, and then they get sort of shoved in the vegetable drawer and buried, and you lose them. So it's sort of, there's a double-edged sword thing.
I mean, I'm Irish, so the idea of wasting potatoes is always really funny to me. But it's interesting because I think we can get them loose here, but I do, especially like with carrots or with other like avocados and stuff like that, certainly in Canadian supermarkets, those are very tricky to find in a like separate single use ones.
Yeah.
Or even like cost wise too, right? I think there's usually like a big shiny sale sticker on like the big bag and not necessarily the single item ones. So I'm wondering too about like even the design of the supermarket and how that connects
Yeah.
to that as well.
Yeah, and it benefits them if you buy a lot as well, I think, because sometimes they overstock. And so sometimes the offers and things are them being like, we've got too much. We need to give it to the consumers by making it more appealing to buy in bulk. So yeah, all of these things sort of compounded, but the fridge for me is like the centerpiece of this whole problem. And it's really fascinating is when you start focusing on it, you see all its tentacles like going out into the food system and how we eat and we buy food today.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think too about, I think it was a couple of years back, there were a lot of like fridge, like hyper organization videos on TikTok coming through where you had people like they'd buy something that was packaged and then they'd repackage it through like a plastic organizer for eggs or for juice or for vegetables. So I'm curious, in terms of thinking about those sorts of extremes of social media showing how fridges can be organized, is that to you emblematic of like changing values around what types of foods we have, of gendered labor? Like how does that speak to what you're working on as well?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating question. Yeah, I'm really fascinated by those videos. I think it's funny because I think there's several things going on. That kind of organization on one hand might reduce food waste because you're making your food visible in ways. You're sort of arranging it in a pleasing style, to be like, this is where my eggs are, this is where this is. But on the other hand, if your primary objective is to make your fridge look nice, then you probably are going to throw away more as well because some things might not look so appealing when they are a few days old, or if you've like chopped an onion in half or something in half and you're like, I don't like the look of half an
Oh,
onion in the
yeah.
fridge or something. So there's that. And then yes, the labor question is a really big question because, well, fridges supposedly reduced labor in the household because they allowed you to not have to shop every day, not have to cook every day. But there's also labor in managing the fridge. And especially because things aren't very visible in all places, it makes you have to go in and arrange and reshuffle and all this stuff, and make sure you're not wasting food as well. So there's sort of a different kind of labor involved in that, is what I'm finding. And I'm finding that the households I went into who wasted the least actually just tended to have more time. And they had more time to plan meals. They had more time to go out and be really thoughtful about what they were buying and to cook. And they had time to sort of figure out what food they had and where and then time to like manage the fridge itself. So yeah, these fridge organization videos, I think there should be a study on them really.
Yeah.
It'd be so interesting to find out exactly what is going on there because obviously that just might be a snapshot of somebody's week. They might just be like, oh, I'm going to make a nice video today, but actually tomorrow I'm just going to go back to normal and just have a messy fridge. But then there also might be this added pressure of making everything look nice, which would take more work. So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, really interesting.
Yeah. I appreciate your point too about like I didn't even think about the aesthetics of, half an onion and what that would mean for someone who's thinking more about fridge as like a nice painted picture almost too, right? So through your research and what you've been working on with the participants too, have you found that there are, like you mentioned time, so that also makes me think around like class and socioeconomic status and the impacts of that. Have you found that there's different like strategies that have reduced food waste for people to varying degrees?
Yeah. And so my sample wasn't very representative of the UK, and they were basically all of them were middle class and financially comfortable and educated and things like that. So I'm not able to speak to different systems within different classes or anything like that. Also, very small sample. But the sort of the systems that I found were more to do with the labour. So people tended to. So one person who sort of worked the hardest, like quote unquote hardest, in their fridge, she put everything in rows. And she said it was like stock rotational management that sometimes supermarkets do, where you put the thing that needs eating up at the front and then you put things that will last longer at the back. And you're just continually cycling through them like that. But that requires you to remember, when you bought things and remember to keep managing it. But she had the time to do that. And also food, like she was really into food stuff. And not everyone is going to have the time and energy to do that. So that was one thing. Another person, because he lost a lot of smaller veg in his vegetable drawer, he actually had a separate little box where he puts his things like lemons and chilies and ginger sort of on a shelf in a box, so he remembered where they were and he could see them a lot more clearly. And then some people also put them in the door of their fridge. So things like apples as well, people tend to put their door because then you can see them and you can be like, oh, there it is, and I'll take it out instead of letting them get buried in the vegetable drawer. I think that was the main thing, mainly making things visible, to be honest. But your question about sort of different demographics also made me remember that a lot of studies about food waste often say old people tend to waste less food and younger people tend to waste more food. And they sort of put it to like a more wasteful mindset of younger generations and more sort of thrifty mindsets of the older generations. But actually what I found was it was all about experience with food. So the older people were more confident with food and they tended to pay less attention to expiry dates and things like that and use their senses instead. And so they sort of knew how many ingredients they needed for a meal and how much to buy and that kind of thing. Whereas the younger generations tended to be less confident with food and they tended to stick more rigidly to expiry dates and therefore sort of might throw something away that didn't need to be thrown away. So I don't actually think it's about generations. I think it's more just about how much experience you have with food, because one of the younger participants I had, he was in his early 20s, but he used to be a chef. So he was really confident with food.
Yeah.
And he wasted like basically nothing. And he was like, I'll eat this like moldy tomato, I'll just cut the thing off and eat the rest of it. And so he was in his household and he lived with 11 old people.
Oh, wow.
He was like the most confident out of all of them for food. So he wasted very little. So yeah, I think it's about how comfortable you are with potentially food that looks slightly off, but still probably okay to eat.
That makes a lot of sense. And it makes me think too, I feel like especially for younger generations, you kind of have to actively seek out the knowledge of how to preserve food in different ways. Like even, we started like dicing up our strawberries and like putting a wet paper towel in our glass containers that we store them in so that it stretches the shelf life out. But I only read about that like a couple of years ago. So there were many a strawberry that made it into the dumpster bin before that, right? So I think there's also something to that too of this confidence in food. And I wonder too about, even if I think to the rise of like food delivery apps and that contributing to a lack of confidence as well.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, it's really interesting how it's all sort of linked. And I don't know, a lot of studies also say education is going to be the key to reducing food waste. But I don't know, I feel like with the example of strawberries, you only need to stretch the amount of strawberries if you've been forced to buy an enormous packet. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what you think about that. And also I'm really interested in what the Canadian context is with sort of food waste and food package sizes, because I feel like if you're already needing to stretch things for longer, that's sort of already a problem, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. And I do wonder about that. Canada's interesting right now because because of like the cost of food rising, there's a lot of produce that's like quite literally rotting at the grocery store before you buy it. So you have to check regularly. You have to check and make sure that, your food is okay. And it's not discounted. It's just rotting. And so by the time it gets back, you're already doomed. So so it's been interesting the last few years. There's also, I do find and I'm curious if it's happening in the UK too, there's initiatives to promote like imperfect fruit. So now I know there's a lot of really cool organizations doing that in Canada, but there's also the grocery stores are seeing the profit potential in that now, where they're branding it as like imperfect produce and then it's at a discounted rate, but it's like a blemished, ugly apples for example, where it's not necessarily pretty, but it's totally fine to eat. So I'm curious if that's happening in the UK too.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's several things with that. Firstly, the problem I think with that is that supermarkets sort of encourage the perfect fruit and veg already. And so now they're like having to compensate for their own marketing tactics.
Yep, I love that.
And another problem is that unfortunately imperfect fruit and veg is bought from farmers at a discount. So even though nutritionally it's the same content as the perfect fruit and veg, so unfortunately, the problem with selling it at a discount means that they're reinforcing this divide between perfect and imperfect, and they're getting away with paying farmers less for the imperfect stuff.
Wow.
So on the surface, it looks like a good thing because it means there's less waste because people are incentivized to buy ugly stuff. But, we're not the ones, responsible for the the division, this categorization of ugly and perfect to begin with, and the sort of, yeah, the payment difference for farmers still exists because of that. So in my opinion, I think we should get rid of all categorizations and just
Yeah.
have the fruit as it is. And maybe people will be a bit picky to begin with. I don't know, if you're cooking something for a curry or, it doesn't need to be pretty.
Yeah.
And I think people will get used to it, to be honest. And so, yeah, I'm basically in favor of not having imperfect or perfect, just the food. But I'm so interested in that case of things rotting in the supermarket. Do you think it's because it has to travel quite a long way before it reaches the supermarket as well?
I think it's a weird combination. Certainly, like when I lived in Winnipeg, it was because that's so inland. By the time the produce gets there, especially in the winter, it's already like been through a lot, so it doesn't last too long.
Yeah.
It's only been a recent issue, and I do wonder how much is because we have, I mean, pre-tariff issues with the Trump. There's a lot of back and forth between the Canadian and American border for food production. So I do wonder, how much that's impacted the distance that the food travels, how much time has taken. I don't know. It's one of those things where there's a lot of like very complex food politics with the grocers in Canada and tariffs and farmers and producers not necessarily getting their fair share of income with that as well. So definitely, if you need another project, that one's a rife one.
Yeah. That sucks. Yeah. We always, I kind of feel for Canada with your crazy neighbor at the minute, causing all sorts of problems. Yeah. No, that's so interesting though. Yeah, I really, I mean, PhDs have to be relatively narrow, and it meant that I wasn't able to look in any other country really about how the food system is different and how fridge habits are different. But yeah, I would really love to do a comparison study one day. It'd just be fascinating, especially in North America. Because fridges actually came to the UK quite late. So they sort of evolved in the US from the 20s, from 1927. But they didn't really become popular in the UK until the 60s, 70s.
Wow.
Because we didn't really even have ice boxes because the UK tended to be quite cold. So people had a like cold room or like pantry or sort of an area in their home where things were kept colder. And I read that it was only when central heating became normal that fridges actually became sold more in the UK because suddenly the rooms weren't cold enough anymore.
Wow.
So so the rise of the fridge in the supermarket in the UK was much later.
That's really fascinating. Oh my gosh. I'm curious, just thinking about the futures of fridges from your perspective, because I think when we think future, we think of like this Jetson future with high tech and smart screens and talking fridges and things like that. But, that doesn't necessarily mean that the design is going to change or food waste is going to be reduced. What do you think is needed for a better future in terms of better designs of fridges and more sustainably minded consumption of produce?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I've come to find that there's maybe 3 options for the future of the fridge that might be more sustainable. So firstly, as you were saying, like this sort of smart fridge, this smart revolution is sort of being pushed on us. But when I asked the participants, I asked most of them, if you could redesign your fridge, how would you do it? Not one of them said, I'd have a smart fridge. Like nobody's really that interested. And also, I think it's one of those things where you reach like a limit of how much you can change the fridge. And so a lot of these fridge companies are like heaping more software onto them when actually maybe we need to rethink the hardware, like the actual physical shape of it. As I was saying in the beginning, like maybe it not being a box. So the future of the fridge, I think, would be a shallower fridge and potentially a smaller fridge, which would encourage you to buy less. But the problem with that, obviously, it means that you have to buy more often. And if you don't have a lot of time in your week, then there's a difficulty there. So I actually think that one of the solutions to food waste is actually giving people more time, whatever that looks like, maybe a 4-day work week or maybe more efficient use of hours in the week or flexible hours. So yes, something like that. And then also I was talking with a participant actually, what would society look like if we didn't have fridges anymore? If we suddenly had to not eat at home so much. And there are some countries that do this more than others where they have their main meal of the day outside the home, either in sort of a communal canteen sort of place, in their workplace or school, or sort of in a food market or something like that, they'd have an enormous like lunch, and then they'd need to store less food at home. So that is another potential future. And it's also potentially a more sustainable future if you're able to then be very sort of sustainable about the kind of food and produce that is served in these canteens, and if they are state run or if they are run by NGOs, what they could look like, what the sourcing of that food could look like. And then because of scales of economy, there'd also be less food waste, because it wouldn't really matter if you had to buy in bulk, because you could use everything up and then maybe send it to people home with leftovers for lunch the next day. So yeah, so the future of the fridge doesn't have to be tech. It can be redesigning the hardware, it can be giving people more time, and it can be not having a fridge at all, which is quite an interesting thought experiment.
Oh my gosh. I really appreciate how your work just looks at, you know, how we can imagine our social and cultural lives a little differently too. It's super fascinating, and I so appreciate you joining me. Do you mind sharing where people can find you and your work online if they'd like to learn more about your deeply fascinating research?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So I have a website, and it's called foodwastestories.com, or why food waste stories. And I'm also on Instagram as foodwaste_.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma. I've got all that in the show notes below for people to check out. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That was Emma Atkins. I've linked her website, Food Waste Stories, her Food Rise policies, and social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all of this at my website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else you listen. If you like the show, please help by giving us a rating on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. For more Anthodish, you can sign up for my newsletter at sarahdougnan.substack.com, or find me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, or Blue Sky at Anthodish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you've been thinking about food. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.